We are now on the top of Pei Beis, Omid Beis, and we're up to Nafkalon on the second line. The Gemara now has rejected the previous derivation based on the pasuk in Vayikra Perek Zion, together with the story of Chatos, Aaron, Ubanov in Vayikra Yud, because we've rejected that. And now we offer an alternative source for the halacha that kodshim shenifsalu have to be burnt. And that's going back to Vayikra Perik Vav. That's Rabbi Shimon. Meter Rabbi Shimon Desanya, Rabbi Shimon Omer. It says in Vayikra Perik Vav, Kol chatas asher yuva midama el oel moed l'chaper b'kodesh lo seyochel b'eish tisarev. Now notice that the pasuk opens up with the word v'chol, and that's always a reboot. And it ends with b'kodesh b'eish tisarev, because yuva dama el oel moed l'chaper. In other words, they passel the chatos by taking the dam inside. Is limed al chatos shesreifasa b'kodesh einli ela zo bilvad. Okay, fine, that applies to chatos, but shar psuli kodshim kodshim ve'murei kodshim kalaminayin. What are you going to do in other kodshim kodshim like asham or ola, or what you're going to do with a murei kodshim kalim? And we'll see later exactly why the Gemara mentions a murim and not the basar itself. How do we know that in these cases as well you require streifa? Talmud lomar v'chol. There's a brackets here. It shouldn't be v'chol b'kodesh b'eish tisar. Notice the extra word v'chol is going to be marba all psulim. That just like chatos shenifsala needs streifa, so to all psulim mukdashim needs streifa. Whether you're talking about other kodshim kalin, kodshim, or you're talking about a murei kodshim kalin. Ashkechan kodshei kodshim kalin minolan. The Gemara says that, you know what? Maybe the ribui of kol is taking you from chatos to expand it to all kodshei kodshim. But how do you know kodshim kalin requires streifa? And again, keep in mind that there's an amazing principle here that underlies the concept that underlies this Gemara, that the holier the object is, the more it requires streifa. So kodshim kodshim requires streifa, but kodshim kalim not. Ella says the Gemara that this din of kol psula b'kodesh b'streifa, that every korban needs streifa, and it doesn't matter loshno kodshim kalim, loshno kodshim kodshim. Gemara gemira. Gemara finally concludes, after all the somersaults in the air, with all the psukim that we brought and all the sources, that it's really Allah Moshe Sinai. So the Gemara asks for Chatos the Aaron. So why did the Torah have to tell me in the parish of Chatos the Aaron that if it would have been brought out of its mechisa, you would require streifa, and Moshe would be very happy about that? There are no extra psukim other than the entire story and the dialogue back and forth, give and take between Moshe and Aaron. So therefore, we don't have to worry about that parsha. Now the Gemara quotes another brayso. Ulatana debei Rabba Baravua. We have a Tana in a brayso that was quoted by Rabba Baravua. The Amar afilu pigul ta'un ibur tsura. Now, our Mishnah assumes, and Lesman the Poli, that if there's a psul in the gufa carbon, like for example nitma or yotze, then we burn it immediately, unless it's yontiv, and then we wait till the 16th of Nisan. Whereas if the psul is extraneous in the bailim, etc., then to ubar tsurasa comes along this brisa of Debei Rabbah, and he is another shita, and he says that even in the case of psul begufo, like pigul, which is a classic example of psul begufo, ta'un ibur tsura, we're not going to allow you to burn it immediately. We have to wait till it becomes nosar. Me Nolan, where does that come from? The answer is Yolif Avon Avon Minosar. Now, what is nosar? Nosar means you pass the allotment of time. And if we have Exer Shava Avon Avon that is going to compare a carbon that became pigul with a carbon that became nosar, telling you that pigul is only going to be burnt when it becomes nosar. So even pigul, which is a psul begufo, has to wait until it becomes nosar, and only then we will burn it. And again, it's almost as if to say that despite the fact that it's possible towards pigul, but nevertheless, it still has some sort of quasi status of kachim, such that we can't burn it. We have to wait till it becomes not only pigul, but also nosar. So the Gemara asks the following question. Why do you derive this conclusion from nosar? Because it says in the pasuk Avon, Nelif Avon Avon Michatos Liaro. Even in the parish of Chatos of Aaron, it says the word Aaron. And just like the Chatos of an Aaron needed straight from the Yad, and Moshe would have consented if it would have been a psul yotze, so too pigul should, by virtue of the Avon. But again, we're not going to compare Avon between pigul and nosa, but Avon means pigul to the Chatos of Aaron. And in the case of the Chatos of Aaron, the halacha was Yisarif miyad. So why are you telling me tu b'tzuraso? Amar the Tana of this Tana Bei Rabbi Baravua will say Chatos the Aaron ki I gavna nami ibur tzur lidoros boy v'hasam arasha haisa. Even in the case of Aaron, where there was a psul in the Karman Chatos. Now that's a gigantic machlokas, part of which we'll get today, about why the Chatos of Aaron was possible. It wasn't Yotze. Aaron admitted it stayed within the Azorah. And there's one or two reasons, there are two shittas about that in the Tanoim. And according to one shita, the Chatos contracted tum. According to another shita, the Kohanim were psulim because of Aninus. A Kohen who's an Onen is not allowed to do the Avodah. He's possibly Avodah. This is something that I covered I have it a little shir once a day, a short shir in Introduction to Kohen. So we have a psul of a Kohen who's an Onen. And because of the death of Nadav Avihu, Aaron Ubanov were Onanim, and that passed the Chatos, the Sor of Rosh Chodesh of Aaron, and that's why they burnt it. But the truth is, says the Gemara, according to this Tana of Rabbah, they wouldn't have burnt it if it would have been a normal Chatos that became possible, because we require Ibur Tzura. That's this unique shita of this Tana, that even if there's a Psul B'Gufo, you don't burn it immediately. You wait till it becomes nosar, ibur tzura. And therefore, nami ibur tzura doros, boy, had it been for all generations, you're right, a classic chatos that became tameh would be possible begufo, but yet it would not be burnt immediately. We need to ubar tzura, have to wait till it becomes nosar. Bahasam, but there in the case of Aaron, it was horosh shah. And here you have a rashash. He's trying to rack his brains to figure out, what do you mean, Horosh Shah? Somebody gave a special edict. And who was that? He says, was it Moshe Rabbeinu? They never even came to Moshe Rabbeinu to ask him whether or not they have to burn this country. He says, Ulai Horoleh Moshe Mikodem Lechem. Biofen Klol. In other words, Moshe gave them a general teaching that Kodshim Shenifsalu is Tiubar Tzurosa. I'm sorry. Let me get it the right way. That Moshe Rabbeinu gave them a general hurrah about Kodshim Shenifsalu, that it should be burnt. And they thought that that general hurrah should apply in their situation, when in truth, that was hurrah shah, but Ladoros, we wait till Ibur Tzura. That's according to that Tana. So the Gemara asks the following question: Hashta the Amrinon called Psulei the Kodesh B'Sreifa Loshna the Kodshi Kodshim Loshna Kodshim Kalim. Is Gemara Gmirole? You've come to the conclusion that the mitzvah of Sreifas Kodshim Nifslu is Halacha L'Moshe Sinai is Ba Kodesh Ba'esh Tisarev Lomali, what do we do with the pasuk Vayikra Vav? That's teaching me by Sarf. Why didn't the Torah have to say by Sarf? It's Allah Moshe Mitzina. You don't have Allah Moshe Mitzina and then a pasuk that's explicit in the written Torah. And the Gemara answers how mi boile she's streifa bit kodesh. The Torah is saying ba eshti sarev ba kodesh ba eshti sarf. Yeah, the fact that you have to burn it, that's halacha moshe b'sina. But where do you have to burn it? And the answer is ba kodesh, and that we derive, meaning bazara, that we derive from this pasuk in Vayikra Perek Vav v'chol chatas asher yuva midomal o moed l'chap ba kodesh is ba eshti sarf. The Gemara asks, well, what about the pasuk Vayikra Zion? Why do I need that, Lamali? I already have Allah Moshe Sinai. And the Gemara answers, that pasuk we needed for that Inyan itself, to teach me that Kachim Nitma'u requires Sreifa. And even though you'll argue we have Allah Moshe Sinai, that all Psulei Kachim requires Sreifa, nevertheless, we need to teach it by Tumah. In the case of Tumah, as the pasuk says, "Ba'basa shayiga b'chol tamei ba'esh yisarek." Salkedait chamino, I would have thought. Kol psulei de kodesh. Every case of psul kodesh, we're going to give a whole list, and all this on the list that requires streifa by virtue of the halacha Moshe Sinai are psulim in kodshim. They're unique to kodshim. For example, kigon Lon Dama. That doesn't have any parallel in Chulin, that you delayed the Zrikas Adam, Vinishpach Adam, or the Dam fell on the floor. Yatz Adam, Chutz Lazar, Nishkata, Palayla. All of these, by virtue of Allah Moshe Sinai, requires Sreifa. And why? Because the Lesnu B'Chulin, there is no parallel in Chulin. It's only because it was Kodesh. That's why the Torah requires Sreifa. Again, the same principle over and over again. The higher the level of Kedusha, the more you require Sreifa. Avol Nitma. In the case of Tumah, the Bechulin Nami Mivsal, Tumah is something that passes Chulin as well. Even though, technically speaking, there's no Isser to be Matame Chulin, but nevertheless, Afshein Isser Lechel Chulin, we come Chalalem Shem Tumah. There is a Shem Tumah even in Chulin. So you can't have a shame dam shelan or sheyatza michutz lemachitzos in chulin. There ain't no such thing. But tumah is something that's common to both kodshim and chulin. Is therefore in such a case, ema we might think hoil vis avid bei uvdin dechol. What happened to this basar of behemoth kodesh, namely tumah, is something that would happen to chulin as well. Chol means chulin. In other words, you didn't watch it carefully to protect it and prevent it from contracting tumah, something that you have to be careful about even in chulin, is therefore, I would think, ema loti boy sreifa. In other words, the chilul here is such a great chilul. I mean, even if it would have been chulin, this would be chilul. This would desecrate its status, and certainly in Kodesh, it desecrates its kedusha. So it's on a very, very low level. V'tiski leva kfura. You know what? Just take it and bury it. Rashi learns that you bury it like a gniza, that you shouldn't allow dogs to eat it, and so forth and so on. But as far as Sreifa is concerned, it's not on that higher level of kedusha to require Sreifa. Kamash malan. That's why the pasuk had to teach me that even in the case of Tameh, of Nitma Basar, we still require Sreifa. And now we get to the Sefer. The Sefer of our Mishnah records a machlokes between the Tanakama and Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, where the Tanakama admits that if there's a psul begufo, then we burn it immediately. However, if the psul is extraneous, like the Bailim contracted tumor or they died, then we need ibur tsura, because as far as the carbon is concerned, it still has its residue, its vestige of kedusha, and we can't burn it until it becomes possible gufo. It becomes nosa that's called to uber to Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka says no, that even if nifsalu habailin, not the korban, but the bailin, because they died or they became tamei. Nevertheless, we will burn it immediately. Omer Rav Yosef, machlokes, this machlokes between Rav Yochanan and Broka, and the Rabbanon only applies in a case of nitmu abailim li achar zrika. At what point did the bailim contract tumah, and therefore the chachamim, the Rabbanon, and the Tanakama say that in such a case to ubar tzura, that's only because it was liachar zrika, this chaze basal achila, that the zrika in its time was matir the basal achila. So there was one moment in time after the zrika when you could have eaten the korban. The bailim only contracted tumah later on. In such a case, the Tanakama holds that it's not a psul begufo, and therefore you require ibur tzura. You have to wait till it becomes nosar before you burn it. Avol nitvu bailim lifnei zrika. If the bailim already contracted tumah before the zrika delos chazi basa, there was never a moment in time when the basa was suitable, was royal achila, because again, the zrikas adam itself was psula, was disqualified because the bailim atmeim, and let them bring Pesach Sheni, but not Pesach Rishon. Is divrei akol yisaref miyad, says Rav Yosef. Even the Tanakhama will agree that we don't have to wait till Ibur Tzura. We can burn it immediately before it becomes Nosa. Why? Because this is a Psula Guf. Why is it a Psula Guf? Because the Zrika itself is invalid. We'll soon see that Rav is going to that Rabbi Yochanan is going to disagree. Meisvei, the Gemara has the following kasha. We have a brayso that says Zaklal Kol Shepsulo Begufo Yisarif Miyad. But if the psul is bedam or bebailim, is to ubar tzura, and then after to ubar tzura yetze lebeis hasrev, and then and only then do we burn it. And the Gemara is medayik now from the language of the Brisa Katani. It says bailim dumya de psul dam, right? Because the sefer that says you need to ubar tzura refers to two cases: either a case of psul dam, like for example, the dam became tamei or it fell on the floor, or and bailim. So now the brisa in one breath mentions a psul dam and a psul bailim, which means that the bailim became tummy or they died. Ma dam lifnei zrika. When we talk about a psul of dam, either nishpach or tummy, then we're talking about a case lifnei zrika. I mean, after zrika, it's not relevant. We don't care what happens to the dam. Is af bailim lifnei zrika. And yet, even though it's a case of bailim shenitmu lifnei zrika, the Brisa still says that we require ibur tzura, like in the case of dam shenitma or dam shenishpach. So this is against Rav Yosef, because Rav Yosef says that nitmu bailim, since the psul is extraneous. I'm sorry, that just the opposite. That if nitmu bailim kodem zrika, and therefore the zrika itself was disqualified, that's a psul begufo and sreifa miyad. This brisa says just the opposite of Rav Yosef, that bailim dumya de dam, and dam means liftei zrika, and so to bailim nitmu liftei zrika, and yet we need ibur tzura, not the way Rav Yosef postulated, that since the bailim were tmeim already at the time of the zrika, therefore there's a psul beguf, and we will burn it immediately. No, the Brisa says we won't burn it immediately. And why not? Because it's not a psul in the gufa shel karma. Elei itmar hachi itmar. The Gemara concedes that we have the wrong transmission here in Rav Yosef. We have to rewrite the text of Rav Yosef. Machlokes, where did the Tanakhama Rav Yochanan Broka have a machlokes in our Mishnah with regard to a korban that nitmu bailav, whether you burn it or it needs ibur tzura to wait till it becomes nosa? That's kishen nitmu bailim lifnei zrika, dafka before zrika. That's where we have the shita of Rav Yochanan ben Broka that yisarif miyad, because if nitmu konim zrika, then it becomes a psul agur. Delos chazi basal achila, because at the time of the zrika sadam, we had no bilan. There was no one around to eat it, and therefore the zrika itself is now a zrika psula. There's no carbon for bilan tahorin. Is the havile kipsula guf begufo? Since there's a psul at the time of the zrika, Rabbi Yochanan Broka holds that we have to burn the carbon. It's a psul begufo. We don't wait till Ibur Tzura. The Tanakhama, on the other hand, holds that you're right. The zrika is a zrika psula, but nevertheless, the psul is not generated by the goof of the carbon, but rather by the bilim extraneous to the carbon, and therefore remains a psul that's extraneous and therefore requires Ibur Tzura. Avol nitmu bilim liachar zrika, which means at the time the zrika the bilim were tahorit, and they were chazi lachila. This chazi basal achila, they're roy lachila. So therefore the zrika itself per se was kosher. It's divrei hakol, everybody agrees. Even Rabbi Yochanan Broka would agree that psulo machmas davar acher boy ibur tzura. That since the zrika itself was a zrika kshera b'shaita, because the bialim only contracted tuma subsequent to the zrika, therefore even Rabbi Yochanan Broka would agree in that case that it's an extraneous psul, and the avodas hakarbon culminating in the zrika is bekashrus. And now you can't burn the carbon until it becomes possible gufo, which means until it becomes nosar. That's two bar tzura. And the Gemara now says that even though this formulation is the correct formulation of Rabbi Yosef, but there is a bar pluta who disagrees with Rabbi Yosef, and that's Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan Amar afli achar zrika nami machlokes. In other words, Rabbi Yochanan Broka holds that we're going to burn the carbon immediately without Ibur Tzura, even in a case of nitmu bailim liachar zrika, which means that Rabbi Yochanan Broka holds that as long as there's some sort of psul in the carbon, we can burn it, even though b'chas zrika there was a zrika kshera. And even though there's no psul in the gufa carbon, it's not notzar, it's not pigul, it's not yotze, it's not tame, it's only the bialim that it's made, but nevertheless, we can burn the carbon, and we will burn the carbon immediately. The Ozda Rabbi Yochanan Taimi, the Rabbi Yochanan and Broka Rabbi Nechemia Amru Davar Echa. That Rabbi Yochanan Broka and Rabbi Nechemia is a Tana, they both said the same thing, and they had their own shita that a carbon that becomes possible because the psul bailim is nisraf miyad, immediately requires streifa, and we don't wait till Ibur Tzura, even though the bailim became tmeim after Zrika Sagda. So the Gemara says, wait a minute. Rabbi Yochanan Broka hadi amara. We saw Rabbi Yochanan Broka in our Mishnah, who says that a carbon shemesu bailav or nitmu bailav is yisarif miyad. But Rabbi Nechemia Maihi, what did Rabbi Yochanan have in mind when he said that the great Tana Rabbi Nechemia also agreed to the sheet of Rabbi Yochanan Broka? This Sanya we learned in the Brisa. Rabbi Nechemia Omer Mipnei Aninus Nisrfalo. We're back to the parish of Chatos Aaron. And Aaron, if you remember, conceded to Moshe Rabbeinu that there was no psul of Yotze. So what was the reason that Aaron supervised the sreifa of the Chatos Sa'ir Shorosh Chodesh? Says Rabbi Nechemia, because of Aninus. Which means that with the death of Nadav Avihu, Aaron and Banav were onanim, and therefore they're not allowed to eat kudshim, because a kohen onain is excluded, number one, from the avodas hakarbon and also from eating kudshim. And this is derived in Zvachim, Masechet Zvachim, from a Kalachom from Masechet. The Torah says in Masechet, in the parsha of Kisavo, at the end of Chumash, it says there that when he makes a vidui, he recites his vidui on Masechet, he says, Lo chalti ba'oni mimeni, that I didn't eat the Masechet when I was an Oni. Asisi k'chol shad zivisani. And we have a Kal V'chomer if in Masechet, which is relative to Kudshim. a lower level of kedusha, and yet the Torah says that you're not allowed to eat bituma, which means that if you are an onen and you're holding on to Masechet, you're not allowed to eat it. And kolchkein, if you're an onen and you're holding on to kudjim, which is more severe than Masechet, you're not allowed to eat it. So this chatos has no one to eat the chatos because Aaron Ubonov are owning it. And an onen is not allowed to eat kudjim with a kavachomer from Masechet. So he comments in the bottom. He says, "Hare lo hoyu bi am Yisrael b'oseh kohanim acherim." We had only 3 kohanim. Can you imagine there were only 3 minyanim that could have a kohen to duchen in all of Shisha Riba? And therefore, Rabbi Nehemiah holds that in such a case, there's no one to eat the basar, and that's why the basar had to be burnt. And here there's a whole discussion about Pinchas. Was Pinchas a Kohen? And he was not an onen, although it was his great uncle, right? When second Pinchas was a grandson of Aaron, and therefore, yeah, these were his uncles. Okay, but you're not an onen for your uncle. So, but they say that no, at this moment in time, Elizabeth, this was before Pinchas killed Zimri, and he was granted the bris kunas olam. So he didn't have a status of a Kohen at that point. So there were only 3 Kohanim on the whole earth, and they were all owning it. And Lekach Nemar, therefore the pasuk says, Aaron turns to Moshe and he says, "Vatikreno si ka ele, v'achalti chatas yomayita b'nei Hashem," meaning because I'm an onen, I'm not allowed to eat the kachim, and I can't eat the karmel chatas, and therefore we burnt it. We burnt the chatas. And Rabbi Nehemiah is telling us that the reason why the chatos of the sire of Rosh Chodesh was burnt at the time of Aaron is because Aaron and Banav couldn't eat the chatos, and that's because they were owning it. So why did Moshe Rabbeinu get angry at Aaron for burning the chatos? And he says here that mitchila mitzuvim heim lechol bechatos hapaninis, that Moshe Rabbeinu actually misunderstood what he heard from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It says, "Chuas hamincha noseres mi'ishay Hashem v'yachlua," and Moshe thought that teaches us that even if they would own him, they would still have to eat the carbon mincha. And he thought the same din would apply to chatas. And Aaron said to him, "No, you only heard this din from HaKadosh Baruch Hu that onim can eat a mincha. And mincha is called kodshei shah. However, chatas, this chatas, the soil of Roshi Chodesh, that's already kodshei doros. And there's no kula to allow onanim to eat the kodshei doros. And that's why Moshe Rabbeinu asked, that's why Aaron responded to Moshe, why did we burn the chatos? So now let's see what Rabbi Yochanan derived from Rabbi Nehemiah. Ba'aninus kili achar zrika havya. That's a difficult line. Why is Aninus kili achar zrika havya? I mean, Nadav Avihu died before the Zrika Saddam. Just 1 second. Ein hazrika nifseles b'mesha ein Aaron ubonav rashoyim lechol hakarbon. He says that even though Nadav Avihu died before the Zrika, which would mean that Aaron Ubonav were onanim, the Zrika is not disqualified because of Aaron Ubonav being excluded from the eating of the carbon. And the reason for that, apparently, Rashi says, because chatos is ikro lekapara, not lachil. It's not like Korban Pesach. V'chi itzruf alter itzruf. Nevertheless, Aaron Ubonav burnt the chatos immediately. So we see from this that Rabbi Nechemia holds that even a carbon where nitvu bailav liachar zrika requires sreifa miyad, immediate sreifa. We don't wait till ibur tzura. And since Rabbi Yochanan said that Rabbi Nechemia holds like the shita of Rabbi Yochanan ben Broki, it means that he holds that Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka disagrees with the Chacham even in the case of nitnu abaylim liachar zrika. Even though the avodas hadam was done by hechsher, nevertheless he holds that you have to burn the carbon miyat. Why? Because there's no one to eat the carbon, like in the case of Chatas Aaron. There was no psul in the Chatas, there's no ochlin. And yet Aaron said we have to burn it immediately. So therefore, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, according to Rabbi Yochanan, is interpreting it like Rabbi Nechemia, that even if the psul and the tumah took place after the Zrikas Hadam, nevertheless, there's Sreifa Miyah. Oh, so I asked you before about this very difficult line here in the Gemara, that Aninus is considered li'achar Zrika. They were owning him before the Zrika at the time of the death of another Aviv. So we'll end this year with this piece of Torah here, which is quoted in the Masifta. He says, "Ein zeh dome l'korban Pesach she'ikro la'achila hu ba." This chatas of Rosh Chodesh is not like korban Pesach for achila. L'fichach im ein b'shas zrika anoshim riv la'ochla nifsal b'kachin korban Pesach. If there's no one to eat the korban Pesach at the time of the zrika is disqualified. Avol chatas shel Rosh Chodesh ba l'chaper l'chol Yisrael. That's explicit in the Pesukim. Ve'hem lo hayu onanim, and all of Klal Yisrael for whom this chatas was brought on Rosh Chodesh were not onanim at all. And again, even though the Kohen himself, if he's an onen, could not do the avod of kodshim even on behalf of Yisrael, who's not an onen, but that only applies to a Kohen hedjot. Avokan hikriv Aaron es achatos shu Kohen gadol. V'rashoy lahakriv af be'aninus. So that Aaron is allowed to bring the carbon even if he's an onen. Again, he can't eat the carbon, but he can bring the carbon. And this is all based on a sugya in Zvach, deriving it from Pasuk Hein Hayom Hekriv. So Moshe turns to Aaron and he says, "Is the problem that you were makriv this carbon by ninus, and that's why you're burning it?" So Aaron says to him, "V'chihem hikrivu ayom," meaning did Eliezer, Elazar, and Itamar, they were the carbon? They are kohanim hedjotim, and they passel midin aninus. But ani hikrafti, I was the one who brought the carbon. I'm a kohen gadol, and therefore ein aninus poselos. The impression I get from this whole presentation is that why is this called liachar zrika? Because with regard to Aaron a Kohen, he has a special status that he could be makriv as a Kohen gadol be'onen. And not only that, this carbon is brought for a kapar for all of Klali, so they were not onen. And therefore, this is only a psul of liachar zrika. And nevertheless, Aaron went ahead and eventually Moshe consented, and he burnt the chatas because it was equivalent to nitmu abaylim liachar zrika, which means that they couldn't eat the carbon And all this evolved after the Zrika. So we see that Rabbi Nechemia holds that even if the psul and the carbon is chal after the Zrika, nevertheless it needs treifa. And Rabbi Yochanan, who connected Rabbi Nechemia and equaled him off with Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, understood that Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka was saying the same thing, that we always need to burn kachim psulim, even if at the time of the Zrika the psul didn't exist, but it became pasul post Zrika. Then it's like a psul beguf, and it has the same din, and it's nisraf miyad. We don't wait till ibur sur. So this is where we're going to stop, and in Mitzvah Hashem tomorrow we'll begin on the top of Pei Gimel Amid Aleph, which everyone